And oh yeah, awesome. So I feel like we talk a lot about this stuff. We talk a lot about like in passing, we'll talk about the relationship shadow and your subconscious mind and how you have to sort of work out the things at a subconscious level within the relationship to yourself to be primed and ready for a secure relationship. Or we talk about how we get attracted to things in our subconscious comfort zone. We talk a lot about all these different things, but we haven't like sat down yet and been like, here is exactly like the roadmap for doing this. Here are the key things you need to hit. Here are the big things to be aware of in the relationship to yourself and the relationship to other people. So we're going to talk all about that today. It's going to be a lot of sort of like new content. So I will answer one or two quick questions when we let everybody file in. But some of the big things we're going to cover today is like, first of all, what it really means to prime the subconscious mind and what that looks like specifically for us as individuals. And then we're going to dive into like the main pillars of like where we need to do priming. So if we want to prepare ourselves for a secure relationship, and another big thing people ask me all the time in here lately is like, hey, can you put more content about now that we're becoming so much more secure? Because so many people have gone through the journey and become a lot more secure, which is amazing. So well done, everybody. But this is like a really good topic for this today, because it's like, now that you become more secure, here are the key things to focus in on and to take a look at and be like, hey, what can I do like a little bit of maintenance work around in terms of the major pillars that make an external relationship secure, and how am I showing up in these major pillars in the relationship to myself? And it's a really powerful thing to keep in mind as you go through the next seasons of your life as a more secure person, if you're here doing that work. To look at like, okay, these are the really important things I have to stay in check within the relationship to myself, because the more our subconscious mind is primed and ready in the relationship to ourselves, the more we can receive these things from people, the more we're actually attracted to these things from people. And you'll see a lot of the time, like a lot of you guys have had the experience of not being attracted to secure people and then suddenly being quite attracted to secure people. And these are good signs. This means your subconscious comfort zone has changed. So we're going to talk all about this today in a lot of detail, what this all means, some of the big things we can get into. I will answer one or two quick questions here first, but grateful to be able to share this stuff with you guys today. So the first question I see here is from Leah. Hi, Leah. How are you? So Leah says, hi, Thais. I read something about the recoil dynamic, which is the opposite of the repetition dynamic, where we look for recoil qualities that are the opposite of our parents' nice qualities because we want to escape the bad part. For example, if our parent was successful but emotionally cold, or was very clever but humiliating, we'll be drawn to someone who's not successful or not very clever because we think without those qualities, they'll be nice. We'll also think someone who shows signs of similarities with our parents is off-putting. Can you explain how the subconscious mind works towards this opposite direction? This is such a perfect question for today, when usually it goes towards familiarity. Amazing question. There's two major things. Number one, the emotional associations you build towards this. This is the same concept. It follows the same output as like the golden shadow versus the dark shadow. If you look at like traits or qualities, okay? I'll give one example. So I've seen a lot of people from narcissistic households where there's a parent who's a narcissist, okay? And a lot of the things that the narcissist has, the person will be like, we'll often see people who come from narcissistic households be drawn to people who are narcissists in their adult life, end up in a narcissistic relationship, or even if their parent had like narcissistic tendencies, we'll see some of that. But anything with trauma, you'll see split, right? It either goes in one polarity or the other. And the other version of this is that you get really put off by things that remind you of narcissism, right? Like any arrogance you find really negative and you want to stay away from. And that's like the dark shadow versus the golden shadow. These things we'll put on a pedestal. And it all has to do with the types of emotional associations that we wire in next to the traits themselves. So the dark shadow will be like, we make negative emotional associations, like arrogance is bad. It takes away from my needs. It hurts me. So we make negative emotional associations. But the golden shadow will be like, oh, this is good. This is, I still love my parent. I still want their compassion, their attention, their connection. And so we'll still yearn after those things. Then we'll make these positive emotional associations next to the traits. And it really just has to do with how much pain versus like attention seeking or care we are seeking from the caregiver dynamic. If we have enough pain from the caregiver dynamic, then we will split off and we'll be like, wait, we don't want to go near that. We want to stay away from this at all costs. But the vast majority of the time, because we're so wired for that approval, that attunement, that connection, we will move more into towards a positive subconscious comfort zone or golden shadow, even if the traits themselves are maybe not negative or healthy for our lives. So it has to do with the impact of the emotional associations, like tipping from one to the other, just like, and you'll see emotional associations like poke their head into everything, right? Like you'll see with needs, when we have our personality needs, it's where we get the most positive versus negative emotional associations. We may have a basic human need for love and connection, but sometimes we get negative emotional associations from connecting through family, and we get more positive emotional associations connecting through community, social connection, and then those become really big personality needs. So it's always, at the end of the day, that subconscious comfort zone is a really real thing, but it's also it's like in relationship to the positive versus negative emotional associations. And so if we've got more of those positive ones, then we're going to be moving in that direction. Now, the other thing that's important to notice, I said there was two things, so that was the first one. The second thing is that we still get imprinted by even those negative things. And if they still are a part of our shadow and we're not recognizing them, we may be put off by them, but at a greater level, we still may move towards them. So we may find ourselves in a relationship, and this is very common for people, where it's like you get into the relationship, you're really attracted to the person, and then later on, you still go towards them, you still stay in the relationship with them, you still show up and participate in the relationship with them. And yet at the same time, you really don't like these three main qualities about them. It really bothers you, it really turns you off, it really frustrates you, you get triggered by these things. And these are usually still that we have a greater subconscious comfort zone around this person's traits that remind us of that familiarity, that repetition dynamic that you're talking about, or re-traumatization in a sense. And yet, these things, we have negative emotional associations that are getting triggered there and that are coming up for us. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense. It's a great question for today. And so we're going to dive into a lot of these different things and looking at the role of the subconscious mind as a whole. So when we are looking at priming the subconscious mind, and we're going to go into this, I think we gave enough time for everybody to join in here. Yeah. Hello, everybody. I sometimes go off the screen and come back and there's all the new faces. So when we are looking at the subconscious dynamic and what it really means to prime the subconscious mind, well, there are a few things that we really want to know. We know that our subconscious mind, there's three major things that create attraction, right? Number one are seeing if somebody's going to meet our unmet needs, right? That's a huge point of attraction that will really pull us towards somebody. Number two, trait variety, right? Somebody expressing our repressed traits, and that can be its own like little shadow component. And number three, our subconscious comfort zone. And at the end of the day, these things can be sort of in competition with one another, but usually the subconscious comfort zone is kind of taking precedence over the other things because it's really, really deep for us. And so all of those things will create attraction. But at the end of the day, if like somebody's meeting needs that you didn't get met in childhood, and yet there's a subconscious comfort zone around certain components of how the relationship goes, that's usually going to tip the scales a little bit more in that favor, that direction, because the subconscious mind at the end of the day is the most concerned with familiarity and safety, right? And familiarity means, oh, it's predictable, it's safe, I know what's going to happen, I'm more likely to survive, right? So if we know the subconscious really wants survival at the end of the day, that's usually going to be one of the biggest driving factors and what like really attracts us towards people. So when we look at like relationships as a whole, and so many of you guys have observed this probably from other people's questions or maybe in your own experience in life, sometimes we can go into a relationship and be like, hey, somebody is wonderful. Like I've met a great person. They've got all these great traits. They have all these things that I'm looking for in a relationship as a whole. And yet I just don't feel the spark, or I just don't feel the chemistry. And usually you'll feel like consciously, it makes a lot of sense. Subconsciously, there's sort of like a repellent, right? Like there's this need to sort of push away. And what this is usually showing you is, hey, at a conscious level, you know this person may be good for you, but at a subconscious level, you may have a subconscious comfort zone that's not oriented towards being secure. Now, don't get me wrong. You can just not be attracted to somebody and just there aren't things there happening for you at a subconscious level. That's perfectly fine. But if you're like, these are all the things that I want, I was originally really attracted and interested in the person, but then as I got to know them more and more, I was like, whoa, I want to be interested, but it's just not going in that direction. It's always important to check in. Well, is there a part of me that's repelling this because I don't have a subconscious comfort zone that's safe and secure in the relationship to myself. And so that is translating into the way that I'm attracted to other people in external relationships. And I saw this post yesterday in the Facebook group, or maybe it was a couple days ago. And I like poke my head in there like every 4 or 5 days. And I'm going to try to go in there more often, by the way, too, and get more like info about what you guys want to see in the next round of courses and like all these things happening. But I noticed that somebody was like, oh, why is it that we keep attracting the same people over and over again in our lives? Why is it that we have like the same partners as our parents, or, so many of these things are so common? And I was like, the subconscious comfort zone. But this is like really what can happen. And when we have a subconscious comfort zone, not only are we usually attracted to that in people, or it's at least one of the major factors that plays into attraction towards people, but also we receive what we think we're worthy of receiving according to our subconscious comfort zone. If we, in the relationship to ourselves, are not treating ourselves like we're worthy, not treating ourselves like we're deserving of love, security, care, compassion, support, all these different things we may need or may analytically need from the conscious mind level, or think that we want, if we're not giving those things in the relationship to ourselves, we're not going to be receiving them from others. Other people, maybe you really need more encouragement or validation or words of affirmation on some level. Your conscious mind realizes that, but your subconscious mind, when somebody gives that to you, might be like, oh, they don't really mean it. You may deflect, you may repress, you may deny, you may be suspicious or doubt. So your subconscious comfort zone will receive what you are used to receiving. And the baseline standard for what we're used to receiving fully has to do with how we show up in the relationship to ourselves. And honestly, there isn't much influence outside of that. That's so primary and so important. So we receive according to our subconscious comfort zone. We also notice things according to our subconscious comfort zone. For those of you guys who have taken the emotional mastery course, you may remember that there's this big dynamic of the reticular activating system. Like the RAS is like your filtering system. And if you've had the experience, like this is a very common analogy for it, but it's like, if you've had the experience of, like, let's say you're going to buy a new car. Let's say you're going to buy like a white Jeep, and you've never really noticed white Jeeps on the road. And then suddenly, as you're looking at the white Jeep and focusing on it, you see white Jeeps everywhere when you're driving. And it's like, oh, there's so many white Jeeps around. It's because what we tune into will determine what we filter according to our RAS. So what we start paying attention to and putting focus on will determine what we filter. But also the RAS filters according to your beliefs and to your personality needs. So I've often given the example with personality needs. Like if you see two people walking down the street together, and one person has a high personality need for romantic relationships, and another person has a high personality need for like exploration and adventure, and they're walking down the street together, one person's RAS is like noticing the couple across the street holding hands, and the other person who has the need for adventure and exploration is walking down the street, and they're noticing like all the cool restaurants they could go to and all the things that are around them that they could explore. And our RAS is always working this way. So when it comes to our subconscious comfort zone, it does that for our needs, but it also does this for like what we already believe about ourselves, right? So if you have a belief that says, oh, I'm unlucky, you're going to filter out all the times you get lucky, and you're not going to really pay attention to them or feed into them. But then the time you're unlucky, you're going to be like, see, I'm always unlucky. So how does this impact our relationships? Well, whatever we believe we are worthy of, deserving of, whatever we believe is going to happen, whatever we believe about ourselves is exactly what we're going to play into the vast majority of the time in our external romantic relationships. So you're going to get into this dynamic where it's like, if I believe that I'm not good enough, then I may find myself like really feeding into dynamics where I'm like moving towards more critical partners in relationships, or I'm really noticing when somebody's critical, it's really landing with me differently, and I'm feeding into that a lot more. So we're kind of co-creating this dynamic. And one other thing that you should know, if you don't already know this, is that our subconscious mind processes, our subconscious and unconscious collectively process up to 1 billion bits per second of data. And our conscious mind only processes about 40 to 60 bits per second of data. And so you are building these like very intricate webs about people and taking in a ton of information about them, their micro expressions, body language, tone of voice, everything in a very short period of time. And then you're only getting a very, very minuscule amount of that information that reaches the conscious mind's level where you're actually consciously aware of it. So a lot of times we are noticing how people will treat us by all these different features when we first meet them, how long they maintain eye contact for. When we talk about certain topics, do they pull away and lean back if you talk about commitment in a relationship, and lean forward when you talk about freedom? Like you may see all these different dynamics, and your subconscious is building an impression about somebody that is not necessarily reaching the level of conscious mind. And this is part of how we like play into things and go towards people who remind us of caregivers or past experiences. So when we're looking at how to prime ourselves, so you see like all the ways that our subconscious comfort zone can impact us. And what you want to see is like, look, if I want a secure relationship, I have to put myself in a position where I am priming everything about myself to be secure in the relationship to myself first. And there are actually key pillars. There's actually major things that we can look at very specifically to determine like what these major things are. So when we're looking at key pillars and key things that we want to prime in a healthy way in the relationship to ourselves, there's 8 major ones that I'm going to try to cover today. I'm hoping we can get through as much as possible. The first one is being intentional. Okay, we have to be intentional in our relationships to others. We have to be intentional in the relationship to ourselves. We have to know what we want. And we're going to go into a little bit more of how to actually prime yourself for that and what that really means. There's like sort of a hidden component to it in a moment. We have to be able to have strong, healthy connection, habits of connection, if we want a secure relationship externally, which means we have to have a strong, healthy connection to the relationship inside of ourselves. Number 3, we need to be aware of what our needs are, and we have to become proficient at meeting our own needs and feeling and believing like we are worthy of having our needs met as a whole in order to feel like we can receive these things from other people externally. Anywhere you have something missing, you're going to find, just for the record, if anywhere that you have a pillar missing from the things we're going to go through, you're going to find are the places that you have pain points and problems in your external romantic relationships. And this can be for all relationships. It doesn't even just have to be only romantic. Number 4, communication. Okay, communication is a huge part of a secure external relationship. How do you prime your subconscious mind for this externally? You become good at being in communication with yourself and your internal world. If you lose that, you're going to see, and if you're not primed for that in the first place, because that's not part of your programming, you're going to see that you struggle to communicate externally. Why? It's quite simple. If I don't know if I'm not actively listening to myself, right? If I'm not in active listening in the relationship to myself, I'm not checked in with my feelings, my needs, my boundaries, what's going on inside of my internal world, how could I possibly communicate that healthily outside of myself, right? And how can I possibly receive that effectively from somebody outside of myself as well? So we're going to talk about how to prime communication in the relationship to yourself so that you're in a good spot. Conflict resolution, and this sounds sort of similar to communication, but it's really like they go hand in hand, but it's internal conflict resolution. How are you at resolving conflict in the relationship to yourself? Because we go through inner conflict, right? We go through like, wow, I feel triggered. Wow, I feel upset. Wow, I feel sad, in despair, helpless, whatever it might be. Well, do you know what to do when you're in that position? Do you know what your best internal tools are for resolving that internal conflict? And if you don't, it's a really good thing to check in with and to practice. And we're going to talk about tools for how to do that as well. Our next thing is boundaries in the relationship to myself, my own thought boundaries, my emotional boundaries, like boundaries around when I decide to go to sleep at night, boundaries around showing up for the things I've committed to, like actually having the ability to have boundaries in the relationship to ourselves, to see different things through when important. And then strengthening our relationship to ourselves overall, having a whole bunch of different tools to really have a strong, healthy relationship to ourselves that we're going to talk about. There's a few different ones in there. And then we're going to talk about trust and honesty in the relationship to ourselves. Okay. So these are huge pillars. Like you can hear them externally, being intentional in the relationships outside of ourselves, having healthy habits of connection in the relationships outside of ourselves, being able to meet each other's needs in the relationships outside of ourselves, being able to communicate, to resolve conflict, to have healthy boundaries, to break down codependency and have a strong, healthy relationship to self while in relationship with others, and trust and honesty. But if we are not primed for these things internally, if we're not showing up to a very strong degree internally first, we're going to struggle, and these will be the obstacles we find in our relationships externally. So first and foremost, okay, intention. What do you want in a partner? Okay. So, and I want you guys to take a moment, and you can put this in the chat, and we're going to be as intentional and specific as possible. What do you want in a partner? And you can write anything in the chat. You can write the standards that you want, like things that are really important to you. You can write traits that you'd like to see in a partner. You can write non-negotiables in a relationship, things you are absolutely not okay with. And the first major mirror into the self is going to be, well, how are you doing at showing up this way in the relationship to yourself? And if the traits that you want, the standards that you have, if you are not showing up internally in this area, you're going to find that it's difficult to feel truly attracted at a high ratio to people outside of yourself in these areas, as well as you're going to find that it's difficult for these things to really land. These may not be, so if you want somebody really supportive, but you are not supporting yourself in any way, then you're going to find that consciously you want somebody who's supportive. Subconsciously, you're not as interested. And so it's really important to see these things. Okay. So take a moment. I'll read through some examples in the chat and give you some pieces of feedback, but take a moment and be like, what are the things that are really important to me in a romantic relationship? Okay. And we may have standards. I want somebody who's ambitious. Are you ambitious? Are you showing up with ambition in your life? Are you, because until we have like a match here, externally, it's not necessarily going to be something we're super attracted to all the time. Okay, so I see the first one that landed when I opened the chat is Tony. So Tony says, warmth, good communicator, knows themselves. So it's like, okay, how good are you with your warmth, right? I imagine quite good. How good are you at communicating? And how good are you at being somebody who knows yourself? Honestly, from like the questions and stuff you ask in here, you're probably crushing it in this area. So good for you. Okay, 2 of the 3. So anywhere you feel like there may be lack, that's what you want to double down on. If you're like, oh, you know what, in this specific part of it, that's what I have to, if I want that externally, how is my subconscious mind going to be ready and willing to receive that in full internally? And it's like, okay, so then what are my strategies to double down on those things? So I'm not sure which of the 3 you are feeling like you're lacking, because you said 2 of the 3, but if it's warmth, it's like, how do I start showing warmth in the relationship to myself? What are strategies? Can it be that I'm compassionate when I make a mistake? Can it be that I like really tune into myself more often? Like, and we can really find out what we would need and how to extract these needs by looking at what that would look like outside of ourselves. Is somebody present with me and that makes me feel warm? How good am I at being present with myself? Does somebody ask me about my feelings on a daily basis? How good am I about checking in with my feelings with myself? Then if we go into good communication, you're going to see this come up in the presentation today, but it's like staying in touch. Like, what does good communication mean? It means like staying in touch with the awareness of another person. And it's like sometimes when we are seeking good communication externally and we're not primed internally, it's because it's like, oh, I'm not staying in touch with myself. Sometimes I'll do personal growth work for a bunch of time on Sunday, and then I'm really feeling all like, you know, in tune with myself. It lasts through Monday, Tuesday, and then I get busy. And then Wednesday through Saturday, I'm out of touch with myself. I stop staying in touch with myself in real time. So you're checking in there, like consistency, frequency, all that kind of stuff. Knows himself would be like, well, how well do I know myself, right? And it would be like, well, how often am I introspecting? How do I get to know somebody else? Introspect, ask questions, check in, all these different dynamics, right? Awesome. The next one is from Jim and Kwan, loyal, right? This is such a good one in the relationship to self in terms of traits. It's like, how loyal are you to yourself? How loyal are you to your own boundaries? How loyal are you to your own needs? How loyal are you to your own opinions and beliefs? And I don't mean that we should be attached like at all costs, because we should definitely question our own opinions and beliefs on a regular basis and be open to more information, and that's healthy. But checking in with this is huge, right? Common goals, beautiful. Are you in touch with the goals in the relationship to yourself and executing on them regularly, Abby? Kindness and compassion, Martha says. And it's like, how kind and compassionate are you in the relationship to yourself? Where do you lose kindness and compassion in the relationship to yourself? Sometimes we justify. We're like, well, if I don't do this at work, then I should be tough on myself. And it's like, hold on a second. If we're looking to prime this into our lives, we have to have the consistency there. Somebody who's excited to be with me. I love that one, Lee. Lee, how excited are you to spend time with yourself? and do you enjoy it? And like, you know, really appreciate the time with yourself. And so then, because if we do, then we're going to feel like we are worthy of being spent time with, and we're going to feel good about that and good about receiving presents from somebody else. If we don't, then we're going to feel like, oh no, I'm a burden to somebody. Oh no, like I'm putting something on, and so you can see how like the subconscious mind will permeate our external relationships. Good with money. I love that. So it's like, okay, how good are you with money? Great check-in. And what I notice with money is sometimes we can be like the spender or the saver. I've had a lot of people say to me over the years, like, oh, I focus on my earning potential rather than my saving potential, or, oh, I'm a big saver, but I like the security of earning a certain same amount of income and knowing it's predictable. So just checking in with all facets of that, right? And noticing that for me to be ready to receive that person in my life, I have to make sure that I'm a match that. So my subconscious is primed for that. Kind, loving, playful, adventurous, amazing, Michael. So be like, okay, how am I showing up to be kind in relationship to self, loving in the relationship to myself, playful in my own life on a daily basis, trying new things, being able to laugh at myself when I mess up or make a mistake, or, not take myself so seriously all the time. Adventurous. How good am I at trying new things? I've heard so many people get really attracted to the trait of adventure. And then they are often also the people that like don't like to go outside of their own subconscious comfort zone. And they're like, and it's like this draw and it's like this golden shadow thing, but they're not like really doing trait integration work in relationship to self. So really good things to keep in mind. Being with someone who is open and willing to grow both separately and together. I love that. And so checking in with that in relationship to self, how willing am I to grow separately and together? Sometimes when people say that one, Michaela, sometimes I'll see that, somebody really wants that consciously. And when they're out of a relationship can be really good at that. But then when they go into a relationship, sometimes they just become overly focused on the relationship and not they kind of lose the relationship to themselves. So just checking in there and making sure that that's not like, oh, but then I have these little codependent patterns and I want it consciously, but my subconscious like gets trapped in these patterns sometimes. And I'll do one more, which is Wendy. And Wendy says safety, intellectual and emotional connection, spiritual alignment, ambitious, good sense of humor, kindness. Those are great. You were like really intentional, which is awesome. So it's like, am I good at creating my own sense of safety in my life, right? That could be through like financial safety, career safety, personal safety, through having like not too many all or nothing thoughts and doing reprogramming around any wounds I am unsafe, and being good at my nervous system regulation work. So I feel like I'm in rest and digest mode. I feel safe on a regular basis in my life. Intellectual and emotional connection. How often do I show up there for myself, and how consistent am I at showing up there for myself? Spiritual alignment. Do I have my own good habits of alignment there? Am I clear on what I want to feel like that bucket of my life, the spiritual area of my life, is fulfilled? Ambition, good sense of humor, kindness. You're just checking in. Like, am I showing up in this way in the relationship to myself in a healthy way? And am I able to receive these things from myself on a regular basis? Okay. So this is our first pillar. And service. I love that, Musu, out of the 5 love languages, high standards. So what we're trying to look at here is like, these things, are we giving service to ourselves, right? Am I showing up with acts of service in the relationship to myself? So you're checking in, and like pillar number 1 here is I want to be intentional about what I want. And then I want to be doing well in the relationship to myself so that I can receive these things more easily. Okay. Even if we're attracted to something that's more related to needs and traits, it's less our subconscious comfort zone, because sometimes these things can be a little bit in competition. At the end of the day, you're not even going to be open to receiving them if they're not familiar, right? We'll go into deflection, we'll go into doubt, we'll go into suspicion or distrust or self-sabotage, right? Or all these different dynamics. So it's super valuable to check out here, to check in here. Now, when it comes to in the relationship with somebody, be clear about these things and how you can execute on them. I'm always going to add like a second part here about in the relationship. Like, if you've just written out, hey, these things are important to me, don't be afraid to put a strategy for those things, right? If you're like, oh, growing together and growing apart and independently, not growing together and growing apart, growing together with somebody and also growing independently at the same time. Don't be afraid to put strategies. Like, what are my strategies to be able to do that in a relationship? What are my strategies to be able to maintain that in a relationship? And to be intentional, in general, you can ask yourself, what do I want to create with somebody in the 7 areas of life in a relationship? How can I support this person in achieving this? And how can I ask for support in achieving this? And how can we really show up to communicate about these things that we're intentional about? Like, it's very valuable when we get into a relationship as well. It's the inner work always first and has the biggest impact, but there's external work in the relationship also, right? For a secure relationship to happen. And it's like, can I have these things that are important to me, can I have ways of communicating that they're important to me? If I say, hey, health is a really important thing to me, can we have healthy habits in a relationship together? Can we go for walks together? Can we, exercise together? Whatever it might be. Part of maintaining that in the relationship will also be doing that inner work, then bringing this into communication with a partner as well. And to remember that anything left on autopilot will suffer. Okay. So we want to make sure that we are clear about our intentions. We're clear about showing up to prime ourselves. And then we're also clear about communicating these things within a relationship dynamic to really see these things through that are important to us. Okay. So that's number one. Number two is connection. And if you look at this from like an external relationship point of view, it's like, okay, so connection, what does that really mean? It means, well, how well am I showing up to connect, to prime myself and in the relationship to myself? Now, where I find people go wrong with connection is a few core areas in the relationship to themselves. Number one, there's strong inconsistency. Okay. So number one could be, I connect with myself a lot sometimes, right? I connect with myself a lot twice a month. And it's like, that's good. Don't get me wrong. That's probably more introspective work than a lot of people who aren't doing personal growth work. And having those checkpoints twice a month is great. It's a great start. But do you want a romantic partner that connects with you really well twice a month? And if you want a little more connection than that, then you have to prime your subconscious mind accordingly. And so we want to take a look and we want to be like, okay, well, what are like healthy standards for me to have in connection in the relationship to myself? And this can be about frequency. It can also be about intensity. So it can be like, how deep am I going? When am I sitting down being like, how do I feel this week? What are some habits that I want to work on? Oh, I want to go to the gym more. I want to eat healthier. I want to, those are great. Don't get me wrong. And that's amazing that you're doing that. But like, how about what triggered me this week? Why did it trigger me? How can I have different conversations? What root is that related to? Like, what big thing from childhood is this taking shape from? And generally, the more deep you go with yourself, the more depth of bandwidth you have to go with someone else in a relationship. And the more present you can also be. You'll notice this really strongly if you pay close attention. People who don't go deep in the relationship to themselves and ask the deep questions and really introspect and really ask the hard questions to themselves sometimes have a harder time holding space in the relationship with other people, right? Because if you're talking about like, hey, this pattern from childhood and this huge fear that you've surfaced and you're like, wow, this huge fear, and I notice it shows up in all these different areas in my life. Then when somebody else comes and talks to you about that, you're like, wow, I noticed the same thing, right? And you're there, you can be present, you can hold space. But if you are sort of just talking about goal setting and more surface things, you can talk about goals with other people really well because it's part of your vocabulary and subconscious comfort zone. But if somebody then starts talking to you about a whole bunch of really deep stuff, maybe you don't know how to operate in that area. Maybe it's just uncomfortable, or maybe you don't know exactly the right things to say. So there's a relationship there, right? And so if we really value deep connection with somebody else, we have to prime ourselves to get comfortable there in the relationship to ourselves first. And that means like level of depth, right? It also means, like we said, the frequency and consistency there, right? How often are we checking in with ourselves? Are we able to maintain attunement to ourselves throughout the week? And then the other big feature that I see this, big place I see this sometimes drop off with people in the relationship to themselves is kind of like we talked about from an earlier intention piece that somebody put in the chat. And it's that sometimes people are really good at staying connected to themselves when they're single. And if we have little codependent patterns, sometimes that goes away the moment we get into a relationship. And it's like, what are your strategies to mitigate against that early on? Because if you don't, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get into that relationship. You're going to be like, okay, here I go. I'm in a relationship. You know what you want. You're in a secure place. You're ready. And then there's still little codependent tendencies that rear their head. And then over time, if we're still codependent, we become more and more, it becomes a vicious cycle, right? We become more and more out of the relationship to ourselves because we keep prioritizing the other person or putting more time into that person at the expense of ourselves. And maybe it's just a little bit at first, but then the more disconnected we are from ourselves, the more disconnected we continue to become from ourselves, right? Then it's like, oh, well, I feel just like if you go through a breakup with somebody and you're disconnected from them, and then you rehash things, you kind of have to start a few steps back. That same thing applies. And what I find that's really interesting, and I've had this conversation with many, many people over the years, is that sometimes when we do disconnect from ourselves because we go through a busy period, because we go through a big life change, maybe you're moving, maybe you just had kids, maybe, there's been a challenge in the family dynamic and you kind of got disconnected from yourself. It's important to note this. Sometimes it's weird to get back into connection with yourself at first a little bit. Sometimes we can feel like a little bit like, I don't really want to sit with myself and do the personal growth work. We kind of get like adverse to it a little bit. And it takes us a little bit to warm back up to ourselves, just like it takes us to warm back up to other people. And so if you notice that, don't be alarmed. It's normal, right? It's part of like the human experience. And it can be also that you just, if it's been more than 3 weeks that you were quite disconnected from yourself, you kind of triggered a new area of subconscious comfort zone, right? We kind of moved away from the subconscious comfort zone of staying in connection. Just note that. Nothing wrong with it. And then take some time to do some work to pour back into yourself a little bit so that you can move back in that healthy direction again. Don't judge yourself. Don't do any of that stuff. Just note that, hey, life happens sometimes. It's normal to feel a little cold in the relationship to myself. And I just have to come back into myself and get back online here again and do a little reparation. So noticing that if we want to have healthy, deep, consistent connection in our relationships with somebody else, that starts with us being able to do that in our own lives regularly. Now, some different ways that we can connect to ourselves can be, what do you want from a partner that would make you feel most connected? How can I give those things to myself? Some of what we just talked about. It can also be like your love languages. I think Musu just put a love language in there, and it can be, that's a great thing. Like if you know quality time is your biggest love language, what kind of quality time do you like doing? Is it with when you're with other people? Is it trying new things with other people? Take some time to try stuff with the relationship to yourself. Go to a new place by yourself, travel to a new place, go on a road trip, whatever it might be. Or is it like deep conversations? Good. Do some journaling, have your simulated version of the deep conversation in the relationship to yourself. So checking in with those things. If it's acts of service from somebody, can you cook yourself a nice dinner? Can you take yourself to the spa or to get a massage? Can you do these things in the relationship to yourself? And by staying checked in here, it's very, very valuable. And then what we want to do is we want to create some kind of like habit or ritual. I find that like, unless we like ground things into like habits, sometimes it can be harder to maintain them over time, right? You can be like, oh, I want to take my vitamins, but like, do you have a habit where you wake up and you like go take your vitamins right away upon waking up with your morning coffee? And if you don't have something anchored in, sometimes we're like, oh, I forgot my vitamins again today, right? Like these little things. So the more you can have something that's just habitual, that's clear, even if you skip it sometimes. Like I know for myself personally, like I have like a morning meditation habit and evening meditation habit. And I like always meditate before bed or always do my best to, and same thing in the morning. But like sometimes if I like am really tired and I snooze my alarm or something, then I'm like, okay, I'll do a shorter meditation or I skip a morning meditation. It's fine. But because I have like the evening, like I'm always getting 1 or 1.5 or, so the more you can just have something habitual, the better this area of your life is going to go. And then when remember internal, external, right? Priming subconscious mind means priming in relationship to self, followed by having habits so that it's programmed in your relationship externally. And what this would look like as well as having rituals of connection in your external romantic relationships. Getting clear, I can't say how important this is, especially because in long-term relationships, we go through things, right? Like your long-term, if you are somebody who's like, okay, I want a monogamous long-term relationship, you're going to go through so many challenges with this person. You're going to go through, I've seen so many things with people over the years. You're going to go through, moving, you're going to go through people going through loss, grieving. You're going to go through people going through job changes, mood changes. You're going to go through people being affected a lot by external things happening in society. You're going to go through so many things with a person. And it's like, if we don't have good habits, then those things will wear at the relationship. If we have good habits, we can mute the effect of some of these things. We can blunt the force of some of the effect of the external world having. And so this really looks like in our romantic relationships, picking like what are good and empowering things to have with this person romantically. And that meets both of your needs, that meets both of your love languages. Like I know, and sometimes people get busy. I know for myself, with my partner, I at one point was really busy with work, and then he was working full time and decided to go back to school, and we were really busy. And then I was like doing this long drive. It was this very like big thing when we were living together. And we were like, okay, we can like literally go the whole week and we live together and we like don't see each other except for like our date night that we make sure we have. And it was like, we have to work on like the during the week stuff. So we just like got up 15 minutes earlier, had coffee together every morning, like sat with each other, talked about stuff, our plans for the day, like emotionally checked in and tuned in. And we had an evening ritual. We'd have tea before bed. We'd sit down, we'd talk, we'd be present, phones away, that kind of stuff. That I remember for me at the time was like such a powerful, impactful thing in the relationship. Like it sounds so small, but it went such a long way. And for him, like he's a big intellectual communicator, and I was like emotional connection. So we kind of like prioritize, like mornings were like intellectual kind of conversations. Like what are we, what's happening in the news and the world, and touching base about different things. And then in the evening, we'd like talk about our day and how we felt, and just like having healthy habits is such a powerful thing. Quality healthy habits will always trump quantity. So if you're spending, I remember working with this woman, she's the first person that comes to mind. And she was newly married and they'd been married for about 6 months. And she was like, we live together. We every day get up, go to work, come home, watch television for like the whole evening and eat dinner. And like, I just feel like it's like Groundhog Day. Like it's just like this repeated thing. And I feel more disconnected than ever. And yet I'm spending so much time with this person. And it's like, yeah, because the quantity of time, you guys are sitting next to each other on a couch, actually interacting with the television, not interacting with each other. You may be sitting next to each other, but it's like not personal interaction. So just noticing that like quantity of time isn't necessarily quality of time, right? And being clear. So what this means is like, what are you seeking in a relationship? What habits do you want to have? And just evaluating these things, right? Like what would be important for you in a relationship? And if you have a partner right now, or in the future are interested in having a partner, then you can ask yourself, well, what would this look like outside of me? Like, what would I want externally in a relationship, right? What would I like to see from somebody else? And what might that person's needs be if I'm with somebody currently? Okay. And how can I facilitate that conversation? So healthy habits of connection to self prime you for healthy habits of connection externally, getting clear and specific about what that connection looks like for both of you. And then communicating and implementing those habits into a relationship, even if they're small habits, will go a really, really long way at like maintaining that prime subconscious comfort zone to maintain a secure relationship over time. Is this all making sense so far? Okay, good. I feel like I'm like giving a lot of information really quick, so I just wanted to check in. Okay, the next thing that we have here is needs. Okay, so you'll see these things really build off of each other. Needs tend to govern the perception of our relationship. Needs are one of the big ways because needs are part of our identity and sense of self. When people have unmet needs in relationships, they become like our coping mechanisms come out. And if we've done a lot of self-work, then we have healthy coping mechanisms like communication, like self-regulation, like doing an emotional processing sheet and then having a conversation with somebody. When we don't have good coping mechanisms, our coping mechanisms come out and we avoid the person, we become more volatile, we bicker, we, have all these other ways that our subconscious mind will try to get its needs met. So we can either be proactive about getting our needs met and communicating about them in a relationship, or reactive. If we have not started in the relationship to ourselves by having a good relationship to our needs, you can guarantee there's going to be challenges and external problems. So one thing that's really important is to notice like what your personality needs are, but it's also valuable to notice like your tertiary needs in a relationship, like just those moment to moment, day to day needs that are important for you, right? So there's not a personality need around presence, right? But that's going to be one of the ways that we receive love and connection and emotional connection. So the tertiary need is like the sort of day-to-day strategy that will feed into those rivers that are sort of moving down into the bigger body of water, right? The 6 basic human needs, and then sort of the smaller streams that stream out of that. And I find that in relationship to self, the things that we tend to crave or yearn for in others are the things that we are usually out of relationship to in ourselves. And the things, and you'll see this like clockwork if you pay close attention. I saw this with many, many people over the years. The things you're triggered by not getting from people outside of you are usually also the things that you haven't been giving to yourself that week. Okay. So if you're like, oh my gosh, this person's not present with me and you're upset. Okay, good. Maybe this is like a little entry point into the self. How have I been this week at being present in the relationship to myself? And usually these things pair together. So to be clear, there's kind of like these separate areas, right? Area 1 is I need to know what my needs are, and I need to be in tune with my needs. Area 2 is I then have to have a good, healthy relationship to my needs on a regular basis if I think that I'm ever going to be interested in receiving these things outside of me. So if I have a personality need for emotional connection and then I'm not emotionally connecting to myself, it's not going to feel very good, because I'm going to try to sit down and emotionally connect with other people. And it's probably going to be that I'm paying attention to their emotions, but I don't know what's going on inside of me. And so I'm not going to feel like I'm seen, I'm heard, I'm understood. Right. So you'll see a lot of this dynamic at play. And then also recognizing when you feel triggered by a partner, maybe it's that the need that I'm upset that they're not meeting, or the need that I'm expecting them to meet, and suddenly it's triggering me that they're not, may also be a very valuable piece of feedback that I haven't been showing up that well in the relationship to myself more recently. Okay. So if we're doing this, step 1, what are my personality needs? Okay. Step 2, what are my needs in general from a partner on a regular basis? And you can kind of look at your tertiary needs list if you want to do a deeper dive into this. I'm not going to go through all of the tertiary needs right now. We still have a lot to cover, but you can take a look at those sheets, and what you're going to have to do if you want to be really masterful at this is look at those things, especially the tertiary things, especially when you're in close contact with somebody regularly, that are important to you from someone else, and to check in, because it will help you be more specific and refined in your approach. How well have I been doing at showing up in the relationship to myself here? Okay. If it's presence, if it's to be seen and heard, if it's a sense of validation or acknowledgement or encouragement, how well have I been doing here in the relationship to myself at showing up? Okay. And what will be my strategies to do this stuff more regularly? And what I highly recommend, especially when it comes to tertiary needs, is sometimes we can get overwhelmed, right? We can be like, there's so many tertiary needs. There's so many things that I would need from somebody else. There's so many things that are governing this or that show up for me here. That is not a problem. Just package them into a habit. That's it. Just package it into here are the 7 things that are important to me. How can I create an evening routine where it encompasses all these 7 things? The more we can package things, when we're doing a lot of this work, you'll see these sort of principles that are really important that will show up repeatedly. One of them is specificity. The more specific we get, the better we execute. If I say I want support, great. What kind of support? What does it look like? Get specific. Tell me specifically. And number 2 is we really want to then take these specific things and just ground them into something practical and actionable. And this usually happens by just be intentional about how we can merge these things together and put them into some sort of habit pattern. Why is this so valuable? Because we're really, in a lot of this work, always trying to target the subconscious mind. And the subconscious mind doesn't land. It doesn't do a lot when we do this once a week. It does this when we have a repetitive routine that's almost every day, where we're showing up and we can just say, if presence, being seen, being heard, being understood are 4 things that are important to me. And if I'm that seems like a lot, 4 more things to add to my plate, that's a lot. It sounds like a lot. And you may see that there's 10 things that you want to add. But then when you just sit down and you're okay, well, how can I get these 4 things all met at once? Oh, I'll do 15 minutes of journaling in the evening. I see myself, I hear myself, I understand myself, I'm present with myself. Amazing. So much easier that way. So we can make things more efficient by just seeing the broad scale stuff and all the different specifics, and then sort of streaming it down into what's a habit that just encompasses as many of these things as possible. And the more we do this in the relationship to self, now the more it feels comfortable, and the more we want to do this in relationship to somebody else. And the other really valuable thing about this is when something feels missing, you'll know what it is, right? I can't tell you how many times people have been oh, I'm just getting bored in the relationship, or I'm just feeling frustrated, or I'm just feeling disempowered, and it's yeah. And then when you really look, you're oh, it's because I have a need for exploration and we're not exploring together. And it's it gives you the valuable information you need to execute and keep improving the relationship and get clear about what's not going on or what you're missing. And you'll see that the frustration in a relationship, if you ever have it, is just feedback, and it's actually there to help you resolve. And then we don't sit in that in the same way. It's oh, something feels off. What is it? Okay, what do I do about it? Okay, I'm going to go do that now, and it's resolved. And it just feels it's much lighter in the experience here. Okay. The next thing is communication. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about some of the other major pillars at a high level, because we still have many pillars to cover. What you want to look at here is if I'm expecting to be in communication in an effective way with other people, I have to be good at staying in healthy communication in the relationship to myself. And this looks like a few key things. It looks like not beating yourself too much in your internal dialogue, right? Not because what are you priming yourself for if you do that? Somebody to be really critical, right? Or somebody in your life to like become that way with you. But also communication means like consistency, that regular communication, that regular ability to really check in. When we looked at like the Gottman Institute, we know that Dr. John Gottman, conducted a study, right? And it was like a study with newlyweds, and he put them in like a bed and breakfast and filmed them all day, every day with everything they were doing in exchange for like, like letting them live there and paying for all their bills and food and all that kind of stuff. And what he found was what we call the golden relationship ratio. And this ratio was this idea that bids, when somebody has like a bid, they try to say like, hey, look at the boat over there. When their partner ignored them, he found that was like the thing that led most quickly to relationship breakdowns, was like how often there was a negative thing in a relationship specifically that tended to revolve around a bid, and what the ratio was of like bids that were tended to versus bids that were ignored. And he found it was about a 5-to-1 ratio. It was like if there was one bid ignored, it took like 5 positive interactions to make this up. Now, how does this relate to our subconscious mind and the relationship to ourselves? Well, how often do you feel, if you pay close attention, little pulls in a certain direction that are like, ooh, this doesn't feel right, or oh, I want to go home, or oh, I just said I would work with my boss on that project. I don't know if I really feel that way. And how often do you ignore the bids in the relationship to your own feelings and needs? And I find this has sort of a destructive effect on the relationship to self. And if you just look at the mirroring component of it, well, if we're often ignoring the bids in the relationship to ourselves, we're often violating our own boundaries. And then we become boundaryless in relationships, and we become resentful, and we become all these other things that sort of can tend to follow. So we really want to take a look and be like, when it comes to communication, how am I at staying in touch with my own feelings? How am I at tending to my own needs regularly and being checked in there? And how am I at like paying attention to the relationship to myself and what's going on inside of my body, right? All the sensations I'm feeling, when I'm feeling like it's time to leave, when I'm feeling like it's time to go in a certain direction, when I'm feeling like I have a need to communicate to somebody or share something, do I repress it and say, oh no, they don't want to hear it? Are we staying checked in the relationship to ourselves? And obviously, a huge component of this is active listening, right? Am I actively listening to myself on a regular basis? And so much of active listening, and why it's so well received by people, and why people really care about active listening in relationships, and it has such a massive impact, is presence is one of the ways we receive love. As children, before language, before we're able to articulate everything, one of the biggest ways that a child receives love is just through presence from their caregiver, just like being made eye contact with, somebody paying attention to them, like giving them their undivided attention. And presence really says like, I care, you matter, I love you. And so if we're not present with ourselves, then sometimes we can reject presence from others. But you'll actually also see that if you're not present with yourself, it's hard to be present with others. And you'll see this a lot if anybody's ever had like a loved one who's very dismissive avoidant in their life and who hasn't done any work yet or hasn't really been aware of this stuff. You'll see, I find that some dismissive avoidants are often like constantly in a state of escaping themselves, right? It's like escaping into a phone, escaping into social media, escaping into a computer game, escaping into a book, escaping. And there's just like this lack of like, I'm sitting with myself. I'm with myself. I'm just pausing for a minute. I'm eating breakfast and I'm just not watching a show, or not on my phone at the same time, or not, or I'm having lunch and I finish my lunch and I just sit with myself for a moment and I'm just present. I'm just like attuned to myself. And I find that like sometimes, especially in today's world, in today's society, it can be a really easy place of loss in relationship to self, where it's like, I'm eating my breakfast while on my phone, while the television is on at the same time. I come home from work, I am turning on the TV while I'm cooking dinner, while I am doing all these things. And it's like, hey, what about just pausing for a moment? What about just like sitting with yourself and being there? And it sounds like such a small thing, but it goes such a long way. Because when we're not present with ourselves, we can also get dysregulated in our nervous system response a lot of the time. We can stay in doing mode, and we can stay like more likely to be in sympathetic nervous system mode as a result. And like just being able to be with yourself sometimes is really powerful. But like so going back to this example for a moment, because I went down a rabbit hole and didn't make my point yet, is when you see dismissive avoidance, sometimes when they're always escaping themselves, what do you see when you're trying to have an important conversation, an active listening conversation with somebody who's constantly escaping themselves? Sometimes they don't even know how to give undivided attention. They're not doing it with themselves. How could they possibly do that for someone else? And I see people in relationship dynamics sometimes get really triggered by this. Like, they're not present with me. Like, they don't care about me. And it's like, hold on. If you look closely, they're just not present, right, with themselves either. And so when we really want to like have bandwidth to be able to do that, part of working on that is going to be, well, let me take space sometimes to just sit with myself, like in the morning with a coffee, in the evening with a tea, whatever it might be, and just be with myself a little bit. And FAs can work on this too. And you know, a lot of people can work on this. Our society sort of pulled us in a different direction around this. And so much of like the programming and technology and all the things that are available to us that are like vying for our attention. But this will play a massive role in your ability to receive presence, think you're worthy and deserving of presence, think that you're worthy and deserving of active listening, and be able to hold space from somebody else so that you can have this secure feature in a secure relationship. So this is extremely important for subconscious priming. And you can, if this is something where you're like, geez, now I also have to remember to be present with myself. Like there's so many things. Don't worry, make it a habit, right? Just make it a habit. It can be a 5-minute habit. I finish my coffee in the morning, I just sit for 5 minutes. I finish my tea in the evening, I just sit with myself for 5 minutes without escaping into something. Just make it a small habit, simplify it. It doesn't have to be something that's like huge and overwhelming and this huge like other task to pile on your plate. Just make it as simple as possible. The other thing, last thing about communication with self too, before we move on to the next one, is part of communication is validating each other's emotions, right? The actual validation part that says, I see you. And this goes a really, really long way. And sometimes we can forget that in the relationship to ourselves too. Sometimes we can get into these habits. The habit can be, my emotions are silly, I'm being emotional, this is stupid, I should just drop it. We can get into the habit of, I don't have time for this right now. I don't have time to feel this way. I can't afford to take the time to feel this way. We can get into the habit of, oh, well, they feel differently than I feel, so my emotion's probably wrong or silly, or my emotion is shameful or embarrassing to share. And as long as these are your relationship to your own emotions, you are going to see these things show up in your external relationships to a certain degree in some form. It could be romantic, friends, family, it could be all of them. And it's going to be very much correlated with how strong that is in the relationship to yourself. So a good thing to check in with as well would be, how much am I showing up in the relationship to my own emotions? How much space am I making for them? Am I taking the time to normalize them and make them okay and acceptable? And if not, then that may be some work that I want to really do. So those are important parts of our active listening and healthy communication. And then conflict resolution, this sort of piggybacks with healthy communication, but conflict resolution, when we're looking at priming our own subconscious mind for conflict resolution and to do well, and to have a healthy, secure relationship that we actually resolve conflict, we have to become good at resolving conflict in the relationship to ourselves. And there's a few things I really want to add in here. Like, what does this look like? For me, and I like swear by this, if I'm having a negative emotion, I sit with it. I go through the emotional processing sheet. Now I do it in my head a lot of the time, but I'll be like, okay, what story do I have here? Do I have a story here? And if I've done a lot of work on stories and there's not a ton of stories there, it's like, okay, well then what need is it? And what's my action step to create relief around this need? And when we can just get good at this, like equilibrating the story, identifying the need, and then communicating about it, it's going to allow us to have healthy conflict in relationships with others. Why? Because I will be able to know what I'm feeling and what I need for relief. And I will be able to get better at finding patterns in other people. I'll be able to be like, oh, they usually have a trigger around feeling unwanted. And when I was really busy, maybe they felt that way. And so I can speak to that, right? I can say, hey, you know, I hope you know, like, I really want to spend time with you. I really care about spending time with you. I value the relationship. what do you need to feel better? Like, what can I do? And so it helps us facilitate healthy conversations, but that starts with the conversation with yourself. If we're not good at having that conversation in the relationship to self, then, and I'm just going to say one thing. If you've been here at the school for a little bit, my highest recommendation of like the biggest thing that you can take away from this in general, if you did nothing else, is going to be just get really good at the emotional processing sheet. It like that is like the biggest tool, because what is it doing? It's literally getting you in touch with the only ways you emotionally suffer, your needs and your stories, which are comprised of your thoughts and beliefs. When you go through repetition of challenging stories that you're personalizing, like when I'm repetitively being like, hey, am I actually good enough? Is this not about me not being good enough? Am I actually good enough? And I'm giving myself proof. Well, the proof contains emotion. So now I have repetition and emotion, which is actually going to reprogram my core wounds for me over time, even if I don't do belief reprogramming. And then it's getting me to get in touch with my needs on a regular basis and execute them, which is like going to be invaluable for boundaries. If I execute my needs and I'm going to end up communicating boundaries, it's going to be invaluable for me being checked in with myself and staying attuned to myself on a regular basis and having hard conversations. It's going to help make communication with other people. It's kind of like the tool that will help you get good at everything you need to do to become secure. So like, if you haven't taken the time yet, I highly recommend just for 21 days or so, until your subconscious is used to seeing things in this way, do an emotional processing tool for 10 minutes a night. What triggered me today, if there was nothing that triggered you today or upset you at all, think of a time you were triggered and do the emotional processing tool on that, and just practice so that your brain gets conditioned to, when you see negative emotion coming out of you, rather than being like, that person, they cut me off, it's them, I'm so mad at that person. You'll be like, oh, feedback, what's going on inside of me? And your conditioned response will be to go inwards and then show up for yourself, question any stories that might be there, execute on any needs. And you're like staying in relationship to self. You're being able to emotionally regulate. You're checked in with your needs more regularly. You're not leaving room for personalization and somebody else's actions making you be unlovable or unworthy. Like you work on all these things at once. And so like really, really valuable. And when it comes to conflict resolution, if you're good at this, it's going to help you immensely with conflict resolution without even having to like practice it all the time or do all these different things. You're just going to know, okay, here's what's going on for me. Here's the story. Maybe I ask for some external resolution around the story. Maybe I say, look, I'm working on it. I know that just because we're having a tough conversation doesn't mean that you're going to abandon me, but that's what's coming up for me a little bit. And, you know, are we good? Like, are we going to work through this? Do you want to be in this dynamic and keep pursuing it? I could use some reassurance. And you can ask for those things externally while working on them internally. And then you can also say, look, and my need is X, Y, Z, and what's your need? And you'll be able to really work this on a two-way street. So just very, very important. And like, I don't want to be too gung-ho about this and like beating, what's the term, like beating a dead horse or whatever, but like, it will be something that benefits you for the entire rest of your life to be good at just that one exercise, in everywhere, in workplace, in relationships, with your goals and vision and dreams, in getting back up after hard moments in life, because we will have them sometimes. Like it will literally permeate into everything in a very, very good way. So like if I had one thing I'm most grateful for was like figuring out that the stories and the unmet needs are like the two things, and finding a way to, like, this tool for me has been like the most important thing. So I can't push it enough. But it will help with conflict resolution, of course, externally as well. Okay. Our next one here is our boundaries. Okay. So when we're talking about priming our subconscious mind for the secure part of the relationship, when it comes to boundaries, is first, do I know how to have healthy boundaries in the relationship to myself? Now, that may sound like a funny concept when I first say it, but I'll tell you what boundarylessness looks like in the relationship to myself. Okay. I'll give a few examples. Example number one, I say that I have to get up every morning at 7. So I'm going to go to bed every night by 11 or 12. And every night, there I am at 3 a.m. on my phone, or still binge watching television episodes or whatever it might be, right? And obviously some people can relate to this. Jeff is obviously hitting home. But this is boundarylessness in the relationship to myself, right? Because what I've done is I know that I have needs for the next day. I know that I have a certain way my habits are gonna make me feel, and I kind of ignore them or repress them. And I like go down this rabbit hole and said, everybody's been there, of course, but it's really powerful to see this. Another example of boundarylessness in the relationship to myself, and this is, sometimes we have to do underlying work for this, but like, Bob broke up with me and I'm not going to check Bob's social media today. And then I check Bob's social media 17 times today. Like it's like when we say one thing and then we go in a different direction, and it's hard because we're not showing up for our own boundaries. And then we are reinforcing in the relationship to ourselves that boundaries aren't that relevant. And so when other people violate our boundaries, we may not even consciously recognize. The alarm bells won't go off in the same way. So boundaries in the relationship to ourselves matter. They have a big impact, and they have a big impact on what we even consciously recognize is not okay from other people. And the better we get in recognizing our own boundaries, showing up for them regularly externally by communicating them, but also doing that internal boundary work first, the better. So if this is something you struggle with, which usually we all have a little bit of a struggle here in some form, I highly recommend just starting with like a boundary audit and just looking at like the 7 areas of life and being like, where am I boundaryless? Sometimes in my career, maybe I'm boundaryless and because I always say yes to my boss or take on everybody else's work, and I don't realize that I have some kind of boundary there. Maybe also in career, let's pretend I work at a corporation and I have a lot of pressure, and then let's pretend I come home and I'm like, I'm not going to keep thinking about work, but I keep thinking about work. Or I'm like, hey, when I come home from work, it's the cutoff. I'm not going to keep like going back in that direction. But then I'm researching about work and doing all these different things. It's fine if you choose that consciously. If you're like, hey, I want to grow in the workplace and I'm going to come home and research stuff for an extra hour each evening, great, you chose it. But if you are telling yourself you'll do one thing and then you're operating inconsistently or violating your intentions in this area, then we are programming ourselves to not even consciously realize when somebody else is doing this to us. So try to take a look in the different areas of life. How am I at setting boundaries in the relationship to myself? It can be with even things like how much time you spend with friends and family. Sometimes we'll see that it's like, hey, I have a busy week. I'm going to go to my family's house and it's just going to be for 3 hours and then I'll go home. And then you're like, oh no, I feel guilty leaving. So I'm just going to, stay for the whole afternoon, and then I come home and I'm stressed and I didn't get time for my own healthy habits or these sorts of things. Or what is my boundary with like having this nice middle ground between taking myself into consideration when I feel differently. So for example, let's say I say I'm going to work out 5 days a week. And then maybe one of those days I had such a long day and I'm just like exhausted and I really just need rest, and being able to say, okay, no problem. Like I'm going to take some rest today. And I can see that I'm needing that more, versus being in a position where we're going, oh, I feel like resting every day. And we don't show up to follow through on the things we're going to plan to, right? There's a fine line between taking ourselves into consideration and throwing away the things that we're intending. So just noticing like your different types of boundaries in the different areas of life, and then noticing how this affects your subconscious mind's relationship to feel like you are worthy of having boundaries with other people, to feel like you are deserving of like communicating your boundaries, feeling like it's safe to communicate your boundaries to other people, and feeling like you are worthy of having relationships that respect your boundaries. Because if I'm constantly disrespecting my own boundaries, then it's going to be a little bit in my subconscious comfort zone to also be around people who disrespect my boundaries, and my alarm bells will not go off. One of the things that was like really striking to me when I was first starting my practice years ago is I remember there were a lot of people I worked with that came out of relationships with narcissists, and men and women both. And I didn't see, and I'm not going to sit here and say there's zero exception because I can't say that, but I can't imagine how there would be. But I didn't see anybody who got into a relationship with a narcissist who didn't already have tremendously critical internal dialogue and tremendously poor boundaries. And I am not here saying like it's that person's fault that they were in that relationship at all, 0%. Because like the only reason that you would have that in the first place is because you were already traumatized in those areas that led to those patterns. So you were already victimized once, then didn't have any conscious awareness about this stuff. And then what happens is then we have a subconscious comfort zone around this. So when somebody treats our boundaries like they don't matter, invades the boundaries, violates the boundaries, and then is super critical, consciously we're like, oh, this doesn't feel healthy. But subconsciously we're like, yeah, but I like spending time with the person, or we justify, you hear the justifications with people. And so, I really want to stress the importance of, when we want to be in a healthy, secure relationship, that starts with us, right? That starts with like, what are my boundaries? What are my thought boundaries in terms of the way I speak to myself? What are my emotional boundaries and how much I take on from other people at the expense of checking in with my own emotions? What are my boundaries in all of the 7 areas of life? How do I treat my own boundaries? Do I show up for them? Do I care about them in my relationship to self? And do I communicate them in my external relationships to others? And do this frequently and see them through. And if not, then I'm like ripe for like, it's like the breeding grounds in my subconscious mind to have challenging components in relationships. And so that reparation starts at the internal level first. And you can think of like the boundaries of being like the expressions of like your feelings and needs. And if you want to do like a little in real time boundary identification process, and communication, you can just like in real time, when something feels bad, check in and be like, why does this hurt? What do I need instead? And is this something I have to communicate to somebody outside of me? And just by being like tuned into that and doing that regularly, you're priming your subconscious mind to get in touch with your boundaries, to hear yourself out around boundaries, and to be able to be consistent in those areas. Okay. Now we have 2 things left. And then any questions we don't get to, we'll do in the next webinar. The overarching amount of connection, consistency, and relationship we have to ourselves. Okay. So I'm just going to touch on a few things here. Are we in balance in the 7 areas of life in the relationship to ourselves? Or are we in a place where we are codependent in one area and excluding the other areas of our lives? And it's a really valuable thing if you want to have like a healthy external relationship that's secure, and you want to have somebody who's not expecting codependency from you, you have to make sure that those patterns are corrected internally, right? So this looks like, how am I at checking in with all 7 areas? And what we've always said here is like, it doesn't mean, I don't want you guys to get this like impression that being good with all 7 areas is like every day is about achieving in each of the 7 areas and there's all this pressure and all this intensity. No, like we actually want to simplify this stuff as much as possible. It's just like, hey, what are the 7 areas of life? Where am I currently the most focused on? What's, in regards to my goals and where I want to consciously grow? And let me like really double down on some good habits in the top 1 or 2 areas. And let me have like small maintenance check-ins in the other 7 areas. So this can look like if you're really focused, for example, on relationships and personal growth, then like do a habit for 20 minutes an evening. That's something related to personal growth and relationships, right? Have a healthy habit in your romantic relationship in the morning, like have those things there that are daily. And then the other 7 areas, like maybe every 2 weeks, you just check in with your budget for the financial area of life. Maybe once a month, you have like a half day where you sit with yourself about your career goals and check in. Like you can simplify it so that it's like things are there, and they're like top of mind in the sense that you've got little habit patterns in there for yourself, but it doesn't have to be like every day, career, financial, mental, emotional, spiritual. Like it doesn't have to be this huge, overwhelming thing. I find that we tend to be best at achieving things as people, whether it's a healthy relationship, whether it's reprogramming something, when we have access to as much information as we need to deeply understand the concept. And then when we whittle that information down into a very simple, actionable habit that we can execute on. And if we can get those 2 things right, whether it's something we want to change in our career, whether it's something we want to change about our relationship to money, when we can really take those 2 things into consideration, let me get all the information, let me deeply understand, and then let me create something simplified that I can execute on. And that's how change really happens. And that's how change sticks around at the same time. So anyways, when it comes to relationship to self, like making sure you're not in a codependent relationship means having balance in all of your own 7 areas of life. Sometimes we'll see, like, it sounds like a funny concept, but it's its own version of codependency. And I've seen this a lot with very codependent people, where codependency is like kind of the absence of relationship to self to a certain degree. And sometimes we'll see people who come from very codependent households it's like when they're not in a romantic relationship, they're like codependent with a best friend, or they're like codependent with their career. Like they're just like so all in with career that like everything else falls away. Or they're so codependent in their relationship to money. And while it's natural and normal to have like a primary focus in life or something we're really working towards or something we're really passionate about, if that's at the exclusion of like having other areas of life there and present and online, we're going to suffer the consequences of that long term. And I don't mean to be like fear mongering or anything, but just we're going to see that if, you know, let's say Bob is like so codependent with his career and with money, and then he doesn't make time for like friends, family, relationships, mental health, emotional health, physical health. Well, eventually he's going to run into big problems there that are going to take him out of the codependency with the career, because it's going to be emergency time to focus on those other areas of life instead. So having just some balance and being checked in with ourselves in a balanced manner also allows us to stay and be programmed to stay not codependent when we enter into a romantic relationship long term. So very, very important to pay attention to. And to pay attention to if you feel like pulled, like a gravitational sort of pull, or more like, not like seduced, but like tempted to get into codependent patterns. Do you have a history of codependency? And if that's something that may come up for you, just to have a secure external relationship, making sure that like when you enter into a relationship, you're really double down on like having balance across all 7 areas of life outside of that. Sometimes we see people throw things away, right? It's like, oh, I've been doing so well with my budgeting, and then I get into a romantic relationship and who cares? I'll just spend all my money on fancy dates. And it's like, wait, all of your work, you're abandoning yourself. So just like being, you know, clear and intentional about all these different things. The last major pillar that I want to cover that's super, super important is trust, honesty, and commitment. Okay, we're going to group them together as a pillar. How are you at showing up this way in the relationship to yourself? How are you at building trust in the relationship to yourself? How are you at being honest in the relationship to yourself? This is a really, it sounds small, but has such a big impact. Like sometimes we rationalize, we deny our feelings, we repress our feelings. You are waiting to have somebody do that to you externally. You're priming your subconscious mind for that stuff to happen externally, right? Or you're going to be like, oh, it's fine that they do that. It's not a big deal. Let's say you have a component of you where you're like, hey, I actually really need a friend to be more like stable and consistent. And then you're like, but I really like the friendship. It's fine. And I like push it away and lock it away in a box. And I'm in denial about it. I can think of a share in here. And so when you see that, right, if that's happening in the relationship to self, I'm being dishonest to a degree in the relationship to myself. And it doesn't mean that I'm like consciously dishonest at all. It's not like my conscious mind is like, I can see that I need this and I'm going to lie to myself. And it's not like a thought process. It's that it's a subconscious pattern, right? It's that usually there was some kind of dishonesty and you would just deal with it in upbringing. And so then it's like normal for you to treat your own experience that way as a human being. And so it's like, wait, I have to make sure I'm checked in, tuned in. I'm honest with myself about what feels okay for me and not. And the more I am there, the less I'm going to be willing to accept that outside of me, the less room I'm going to have that for be as a part of my subconscious comfort zone. And it's a really powerful place to check in with. And the less we're going to be okay, the more we're going to have like big alarm bells when it's like, hold on a second here. Somebody's trying to gaslight me, or somebody's trying to tell me that things should be this way when I don't agree. And it's okay to not agree. Let me disagree. And then we'll find some kind of resolution if we want to. But really being able to like be honest about how you feel, what you need, what's acceptable for you, what your standards are, what non-negotiables are, and really allow that information to come to the conscious mind's level and be utilized. And if we feel like, no, I can't, or I shouldn't, or it's a subconscious comfort zone to have dishonesty, then a great way of reprogramming this is just on a regular basis to do a check-in, like an audit in your 7 areas of life, and be like, how am I honestly feeling about my career? How am I honestly feeling about my relationship to money? How am I honestly feeling about my friends right now? Where is there anywhere where I'm not noticing something consciously that I need to be honest with myself about, that's affecting me, that's hurting me? And if we're doing work, and usually it's because there was some kind of, usually if we're struggling with this one, It's because there's been some sort of programming where we had a lot of dishonesty in childhood or potentially in a past romantic relationship that we were in for a long time or whatever it might be. And we have to learn to like get that back online, because maybe we got used to being gaslit, or maybe we got used to dishonesty and just kind of like throwing our hands up and saying whatever. So we want to like really make that not okay. And we want to make it so that we're super honest with how we're feeling, what we're needing, what's going on in each of the 7 areas of life. And we're intentional about doing that, because it will help us more clearly execute on moving towards things that are okay for us and moving away from things that are not. And without hesitation and without it taking a while to sort of process. And so that will be really important. And then also trust. And trust in the relationship to ourselves is consistency, congruency, having boundaries, and taking ourselves into consideration. And when we are being consistent in the relationship to ourselves and the things that are important to us, when we're congruent, when we try our best to say what we're going to do and then show up for it, it doesn't mean be perfect. It means do well, be as congruent as possible. And then when we're able to take ourselves into consideration more regularly and set our own boundaries and have our own back, we build really strong trust in the relationship to ourselves. And as a byproduct of this, we feel way safer in our world. And one of the hardest things I found for people when they had a lot of trust wounds, and I used to have huge trust wounds, was almost this like, well, first of all, if you don't have good boundaries, right, then the world is an unsafe place. Everybody can take advantage of you, and you can't do anything until you get angry and cut off the relationship if you're full avoidant, or you just keep allowing it, maybe if you're more anxious leaning, right? So the world's a scary place because everybody can just do what they want with your time, energy, effort, all these different things. And then at a deeper level, we don't trust ourselves, right? Because we're like, hey, I don't trust myself to show up and to set a boundary. And so there's this like fractured relationship to trust that really needs to be repaired by us showing up, executing a boundary, being honest with ourselves first about what's okay and what's not for us, and then showing up to act accordingly. And then having that consistency in the relationship to ourselves. And if we struggle with that, again, try to make a habit, try to program consistency into your life by being intentional about it, by using your conscious mind to say, okay, I'm going to try to do a meditation routine once every morning for 10 minutes, and start small. When we're building consistency to build trust, you don't have to be like, I'm going to do 14 things today for my routine and then execute on it. You want to start really tiny and show yourself that you can do it. That's actually part of the building trust process. Just like if you're trying to rebuild trust in an external relationship, it's hard if you put so much pressure on it all at once. You start with the small things and you chip away at like making it better and easier and going from there. And so we have to do that in the relationship to ourselves for that consistency and congruency element. And then by being able to take ourselves into consideration more honestly, being honest about our feelings, honest about our needs, that's why these ones go hand in hand, and being out of denial. And if we are in denial sometimes, it's because our needs were denied so much as a kid. Okay. It's not anyone's fault. It's like the result of trauma. And so it's a call for you to get back in touch more regularly, right? To check in consciously and intentionally with each of the 7 areas and show up from there. Okay. So this is it for our major pillars. We'll leave room for hopefully 1 or 2 questions. Thank you. And what I would say here is like, check in, and what you can extract from this is like, where did I show up the least, or where did I have maybe the most struggle in any of these areas, in the relationship to myself? Simplify it. Don't take on too much. Just make something simple. What can I do in a habitual way for the next 21 or so days until this becomes more of a normalized part of my life? Or what are the 2 things that I want to put into the same routine of 15 minutes to just chip away at this more regularly, and just to move myself in a direction of being more secure internally. And then as a byproduct, I will see my subconscious comfort zone shift. I'll feel better and healthier within myself each day. And I will be attracted to healthy things and want healthy things in my external relationships, not just consciously, but at a subconscious level as well. So with that being said, I am going to, let's see here. Oh, I think everybody can, Maria, you may already be unmuted, but if so, you are the first person in line here. So if you would like to go ahead, please do. Maria, are you there? For some reason, Maria, yours doesn't let me ask to unmute. Oh no, you're definitely unmuted because your microphone's unmuted. Okay, I'm gonna let Abby go ahead, And then Maria, I'll keep my eyes peeled for you for the next one because I think your sound may be off. I think that might be what's happening. And if you want to just check on that, your how come everybody's waving? Oh, is that just to Maria? Oh, you can hear Maria talking? Oh, okay. Okay. That's what I was wondering. I was like, am I missing something? Okay, thank you. Okay, so Maria, next time you can go to your microphone at the bottom and you can click the little up arrow and you might be able to select sound on there. No, okay. Jeff says no. Jeff's always right about technology, so I'm just gonna listen to Jeff. Okay, Abby, if you would like to go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Thais. I'm excited. This is my first live question. So I'm hoping this question comes out the right way. I don't know if it will, but is there a difference between being is there a difference between being a hypocrite and just not being able to meet a certain standard that you desire to have in a partner? For example, if I wanted someone who has their own place and is independent, but I still live at home and have some like disadvantages because of my disability or a unique situation. Because like housing is really expensive in our area, and then COVID hit, and I was still in college, and just because of some circumstances, I had to live at home through college. But if I still haven't been able to fulfill that goal, but I want somebody who's like responsible and has their own place, because I've always been like attracted to people who are older. Does that make me a hypocrite? I guess is my question.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. So a really, really wonderful question, very insightful as well. So thank you for asking that. So no, not at all. The where we would call it like a hypocrite would be when it goes like this, when we aren't making a plan or having a goal for ourselves to try to show up and move in that direction also. And when we are actively like diminishing somebody or criticizing them or like judging them or saying negative things about them for not having that thing. Okay, so the hypocrite part sort of has the like major criticism component while also not even having a plan or ideals for ourselves to move in that direction. So I would say like life's gonna happen, right? So many people had to like move home. It sounds like you just finished university as well. So like, you know, like most people nowadays are living at home for a while after college. So that's like very normal. But then it's like, do you have a 5-year plan to move in a different direction? Or is that something you want long-term? Or will you be somebody who contributes to somebody else and who's taking responsibility for your life? And because it sounds like you're already in that space, like you're learning, you're growing, you value responsibility, finish school, like not hypocritical at all. And then also the real hypocrite part specific to this example would be if you were like, oh, look at that irresponsible person who's not living at home. What an, you know, if you were like judging it from that space, that's what makes it hypocritical.
Okay, because I was like, I mean, I wouldn't, if somebody had like a certain similar situation to me, I wouldn't judge them. It's just part of adulting, and I just have certain disadvantages because of my situation. And I don't want to hold myself to like a different standard than people, but like I have to be realistic, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I think it's healthy to say this is something that I'm looking for, is somebody responsible in these different things that are important to me. And then also like the internal part would be like, okay, so what responsibilities can I take for myself in my own life, which from the sounds of your question sounds like you're already doing. And then the absence of harsh judgment as well. So as long as you don't have those two things in there, then nothing hypocritical at all.
Okay, thank you.
Great question. Beautiful question. Okay, we'll do one more quick one. And then even if I can't answer it in time, then I'll answer it in the next one. So Beth, if you want to go ahead and ask, and maybe I'll answer it in the beginning of the next webinar.
Oh, hi. Oh, yeah. The lights come on. My sort of like first preemptive question is, I am actually like quite drunk at the moment, not like super drunk, but definitely under the influence of alcohol. So is it okay that I ask a question like, even though I am definitely under the influence? Yes.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I just wanted to double check. And also I also want to say that actually for this question I do want to set the context, which I think would take me quite a bit of time, so it's definitely not a short question.
Okay, so what I'll do is you'll be the first question at the end of the live Q&A then. And thank you for asking, for sharing, and
thank you.
Yeah. And for your vulnerability to share that as well.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. Okay, so what we'll do, it's already 2:30 actually. Wow. 3:30 for Eastern time. So I'll jump on to the next webinar. I'm going to run to the bathroom super, super quick. I'll be there in 1 minute.